Abigail had been working in the nursing home for months, but she had never seen anything like this before. She stood frozen in the middle of the room as her eyes drifted from item to item. It was worse than she ever could have imagined. She thought the teenage boy had been visiting his grandfather out of the kindness of his heart, but now she knew that wasn't the case. It was far worse than she thought. The boy would show up every day at 3 p.m. to see his grandfather. She always greeted him with a friendly smile, unaware of what he was really up to or what he had been hiding in his backpack. But one seemingly normal day, while the old man was out getting lunch, she decided to enter his room. She had no idea what she was about to come across. Abigail didn't want to snoop. That day she had been doing Mr. Morrison's laundry and went into his bedroom to place his freshly washed clothes on his bed. But the second she walked through his bedroom door, she noticed the terrible smell. It was an intense and overwhelming smell. It was unlike anything she had ever smelled before. But where was it coming from? She held her breath as she placed the clothes on his bed, but after a few seconds she had to gasp for breath. It was a terrible chemical smell. She wondered if it might have been a cleaning agent, but she couldn't tell. She had to investigate. She didn't know it at the time, but Mr. Morrison had been hiding a terrible secret. She began searching high and low for the cause of the stench. She began opening the drawers of his bedside tables and even looked inside his closet. But she couldn't find anything. Was she imagining it? When a fellow nurse passed the room, Abigail quickly called her inside. Maybe she could tell her what the smell was. Veronica, she called to her friend. The woman spun around and walked toward the room. But as soon as she did, her face twisted in disgust. "Oh my gosh, what is that horrible smell?" Veronica questioned, pinching her nose in an attempt to shield herself from the smell. They were about to learn how bad it really was. "I don't know. I've looked everywhere, but I can't tell where it's coming from," Abigail said, slightly frustrated. Lunchtime was almost over, and she knew the old man would be back soon. "Have you checked under the bed?" Veronica asked. She hadn't, and as soon as she did, she found the source of the smell. She found something truly worrying. Born and raised in Omaha, Nebraska, Abigail Netman had always had high ambitions for herself. By the time she was 26 years old, she finally found a safe and secure job in the nursing industry. When she first learned that the nursing home was looking for new nurses, she instantly knew that it was the perfect place for her. The nursing home was only 2 miles from her home, which meant that she had an easy commute to work every single day. As soon as she got involved with the nursing home, she knew that she belonged there. Her colleagues were amazing, and she loved the old people she got to look after every single day. But one old man stood out to the young woman. Mr. Morrison was a charming and kind old man. According to the other staff members, we'd lived in the nursing home for years. As far as they were all concerned, Mr. Morrison was one of the kindest people they knew. He often cracked jokes and pranks with the staff. Overall, he was a joy to be around. But no one knew that the old man hid a dark secret behind closed doors. Every morning when Abigail arrived at the nursing home, Mr. Morrison would be in the cafeteria, enjoying a steaming cup of coffee. "Morning, Mr. Morrison," she would greet. "Got any visitors coming today?" But the old man always had the same response. He would nod with a smug grin before chirping a quick, "My grandson." Throughout Abigail's time in the nursing home, she learned one thing about the old man. Mr. Morrison loved his grandson, and he cherished his visits more than anything else in the world. Each day the teenager would show up at 3 p.m. Mr. Morrison and the boy would then go into his room and spend the afternoon playing board games together. At least, that's what the old man was telling everyone they were doing. Abigail thought it was adorable. Every afternoon the boy would show up with his black backpack. She'd always assumed that he was bringing the board games over. But the story was far different than she ever could have imagined. Mr. Morrison and the boy almost got away with it until one casual afternoon. Abigail was about to stumble across something truly horrifying. That day was just like any other. It was 1 p.m. on a Thursday, and Mr. Morrison and one of his nursing home friends had decided to go out for lunch. It was at this time that Abigail decided to head into his room. It was never Abigail's intention to snoop. That day she had done the old man's laundry. and she simply wanted to place it on top of his bed. But as soon as she walked through his bedroom door, a terrible stench reached her nose. The second the smell hit her nostrils, Abigail cringed. It was intense and overwhelming, like some kind of harsh cleaning agent. The young woman was confused. She had never smelled anything like this inside of Mr. Morrison's room before. She had to know what was causing such a vile stench. She knew better than to snoop around the old man's room, but she couldn't help herself. She searched high and low for the cause of the strange scent, but there was nothing. For a moment, she wondered if she was imagining it. It was then that one of the fellow nurses passed the room, and Abigail quickly called out to her. Perhaps she would know what that smell was. She stopped closer to the door. Veronica, she called after the nurse, catching her attention immediately. Veronica walked toward the door, but as soon as she got close, her face twisted in disgust. "Oh my gosh, what is that horrible smell?" she exclaimed, cupping her hand over her nose in an attempt to shield herself from the smell. But the truth was far worse than they ever could have expected. "I don't know. I've looked everywhere, but I can't tell where it's coming from," Abigail said. Lunchtime was almost over, and she expected the old man to arrive back at any moment. "Have you checked under the bed?" Veronica asked. Abigail hadn't, which was why she quickly got onto her knees and checked below the bed. But as soon as she did, she found the source of the terrible smell, and it was something truly horrific. The second Abigail's eyes landed on the multiple objects under Mr. Morrison's bed, her blood ran cold. She could feel her stomach twisting into a tight knot as she slowly brought her head back up. Veronica instantly noticed the distressed look on her face. "It's really bad," Abigail announced, astonished by the sight before her. Abigail couldn't believe her eyes. She had worked in the nursing home for months, but she had never seen anything like this before. Her eyes drifted from item to item. All along, it was much worse than she ever could have imagined. For months, she thought the teenage boy had been visiting his grandfather out of the kindness of his heart. But now, she knew better. The situation was far more sinister than she ever could have imagined. But before she could say anything else, she noticed another presence in the room. She had been caught red-handed. Abigail didn't even notice something. She kept looking at everything she had uncovered. How was this even allowed on the premises? She had so many questions. How was Mr. Morrison getting these? There was no way the nursing home would ever allow this, especially since she knew Mr. Morrison was on all kinds of medications. Why was Mr. Morrison even doing this to himself? He was no spring chicken, and by doing all this he was just harming himself. Abigail had no words for what she was looking at. It looked like she was the only nurse who knew about this, and she didn't know what she was going to do with this information. Abigail's heart was heavy as she stood in Mr. Morrison's bedroom. She imagined the fear in his eyes and the pain etched on his face. It was like looking at a mirror image of her past. The same dark secret that had torn her family apart years ago was now lying under Mr. Morrison's bed. Memories of her father's own struggles flooded her mind, but this time she was determined to help. Yet as she stood there, tears streaming down her face, she wondered if her help would be enough. Should she take drastic action to save the old man from the same fate as her father? Her hands were trembling with anticipation as she finally made up her mind and reached for her phone. With a sense of urgency, she quickly snapped a picture of what she had just discovered. But she had no idea what was about to happen. Her heart was racing as she knew that she finally had the evidence she needed to take the proper actions. However, before she could do anything, she heard the sound of footsteps, sending a chill down her spine. Abigail's heart skipped a beat as she heard a faint sound coming from the door. She quickly turned around and saw a shadowy figure peeking out from the crack in the doorframe. Her eyes widened with fear as she realized that it could be the old man. If she was caught by him now, there was no telling how he would react. She knew that she needed to get out of there before it was too late, but the only exit was now blocked by the old man at the door. Dread flooded her system as she looked around the room, trying to come up with a plan. The atmosphere was tense and Abigail's mind was racing as she considered her options. Finally, after a moment of hesitation, she decided that her only salvation would test her limits. She would have to go underneath the bed. It was a risky move, but she had no other choice if she wanted to avoid getting caught. But things would only get harder. As she crawled under the bed, her heart was pounding in her chest, and her breath was coming in short gasps. The space was cramped and dark, and the dust and cobwebs that clung to her clothes made her shiver. But she knew that she had to stay there until the danger had passed. She listened carefully, hoping to hear the sound of the door closing and the footsteps getting louder. As the elderly man slowly turned the doorknob, the nurse Abigail moved with haste and stealthily crawled under his bed, her heart pounding with the fear of being caught. She knew that even the slightest noise could give her away, prompting Mr. Morrison to investigate the source of the disturbance. She was in a tough position. In an attempt to maintain her silence, Abigail pressed her hand tightly against her mouth, but the nauseating odor that permeated the air was overpowering, making her struggle to hold her breath. The stench that filled the air was nauseating and repulsive, unlike anything Abigail had ever encountered before. It took her only a few moments to realize the source of the odor, an illegal item that the old man had hidden under the bed. While she knew that she had to help him with this, her immediate concern was to find a way out of the situation without getting into trouble. As Mr. Morrison made his way towards the armchair, Abigail could hear the sound of his labored breathing and the rustling of his newspaper as he settled himself down. She felt the beads of sweat forming on her forehead as she crouched, barely daring to breathe, beneath the bed. She prayed silently that the old man would not notice her presence and give her a chance to slip out unnoticed. But as she listened to the sound of him turning the pages of the paper, she realized with a growing sense of dread that he might remain in the room for hours. The question weighed heavily on her mind. What should she do? Abigail found herself in a precarious situation. She was hiding underneath an old man's bed, waiting for him to finish reading so she could sneak out undetected. However, as time passed, she realized that it could take hours for the old man to finish his book. Then she felt her phone in her pocket. It was her salvation. Feeling trapped and desperate, Abigail remembered that she had her phone with her. She carefully retrieved it from her pocket and scrolled through her contacts until she found Becky's number. Becky was a nurse whom Abigail had befriended, and despite not being entirely sure if she could help, Abigail knew that she was her only hope. With trembling fingers, Abigail dialed the number and waited anxiously for Becky to pick up. Abigail was hiding under the bed, her heart beating fast as she tried to keep her breathing quiet. She reached for her phone and dialed Becky's number, hoping that she would answer quickly. When Becky finally picked up, Abigail spoke as quietly as possible. "Becky, it's me. Can you please distract Mr. Morrison? I need to get out of here, but I can't risk him hearing me." Her words were tense, urgent, and filled with fear. Just a few moments after making the phone call, Abigail wondered if she would ever make it out of Mr. Morrison's room. She had just put down the phone after receiving a troubling call when she heard a knock at the door. Upon opening it, she found no one there. Suddenly she heard Becky's voice yelling down the hall. It turned out that she had forgotten to give Mr. Morrison his pills. As he grumbled and hobbled towards the dispensary, Abigail followed close behind. She couldn't shake off the feeling that she had to do something about what she had just discovered. Despite feeling relieved to be out of harm's way, she knew that the events of that day would stay with her for a long time. She was really fond of Mr. Morrison, and she didn't want him to be in trouble. However, she couldn't keep something like this to herself. This was serious, and she was a nurse. If it came out that she knew about this and kept it quiet, she could very well lose her job. A job she loved and worked very hard for. Was it worth the risk? Abigail didn't think so. She needed to make a decision. She couldn't let something like this happen under her watch. That was not what they taught her at nursing school. She needed to look out for the patient, no matter what, even if it meant that her patient might not be happy. Abigail also felt really sad. She didn't know the circumstances of what she had found. What if she got the wrong end of the stick? What if there was a perfectly good explanation for everything that she had uncovered? Maybe it didn't belong to Mr. Morrison at all. Abigail hoped for the best, not knowing that she was being watched. Mr. Morrison had come home from his lunch out with his friend, and he was now standing at the entrance of his room. For a moment he seemed confused, but then he realized what was going on. No one said a word as Mr. Morrison let out a heavy sigh. Abigail slowly rose from the floor, one of the objects in her hands. He knew that it was over for him. Abigail's heart ached as she stared at the wordless man. In a matter of seconds, her perspective of the old man had completely changed. What was she supposed to do now? Luckily for Abigail, Veronica knew just what to do. Once Mr. Morrison was inside of the room, she walked toward the door and shut it behind him. "I think we need to speak about this, Mr. Morrison," she said gently. Mr. Morrison remained silent, his eyes shifting nervously toward Abigail. The weight of the situation hung heavy in the air, suffocating any semblance of normalcy that once existed in the room. Abigail took a deep breath, steeling herself for the conversation ahead. "I found the items under your bed, Mr. Morrison," she said, her voice calm but firm. "Can you explain what's going on?" For a moment it seemed as though Mr. Morrison might deny everything. His lips parted, but no words came out. Instead, he slumped into the nearest chair, defeat etched into every line of his weathered face. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, he spoke. I can't explain," he muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. "I never meant for anyone to find out." Abigail shivered, the gravity of the situation sinking in. What had started as a routine day at the nursing home had spiraled into something dark and sinister. She couldn't shake the feeling of unease that settled like a heavy cloak around her shoulders. Abigail's silence spoke volumes. She knew that she couldn't turn a blind eye to what she had discovered. Mr. Morrison looked very nervous, but he wanted to say something in his defense. "It's the only thing that makes me very happy when I feel down and depressed. It's the only thing that brings me solace when I think about Doris, my wife." Abigail could see the sadness in his eyes. She really felt sorry for him, but what he was doing was not a solution to his problems. She knew that a lot of the elderly patients in the home missed their families, especially when no one came to visit. It was heartbreaking to see. She wouldn't wish it on her worst enemy. It was terrible to see some of them so lonely. However, it was time to help and find a solution. What she found under Mr. Morrison's bed was certainly not it. The old man took a seat on his bed while Abigail and Veronica grabbed chairs for themselves. Mr. Morrison had a problem, and the first step in solving this problem was admitting that it existed. Tears burned behind the old man's eyes. He had been hiding a terrible secret for many years, but now everyone knew the truth. But what was his secret? Mr. Morrison and Abigail sighed, noticing the disappointment and shame on the old man's face. It was clear that he never wanted this secret to come out. She decided to continue. "I came in here to drop off some laundry, and I noticed the smell. When I looked under your bed, I noticed all the empty bottles of alcohol. I want you to know that Veronica and I are here to help you." Mr. Morrison stared down at his hands, scared to face the people who now knew his darkest secret. For all his life, the old man had struggled to control his use of alcohol, and no one knew that except for one person. "You know," he started. "That kid that shows up here every day, he's not even my grandson. He's a friend of mine's grandson. He brings me the bottles in his backpack in exchange for some money. He's 21 years old," he revealed. Abigail and Veronica were astonished. Although they couldn't believe what they had just found, they promised to help the old man. He had put a smile on their faces every single day. It was their turn to do something for him. "Mr. Morrison, we are going to get you the help you need, all right," Veronica said, and stood up from her chair. "I just need to make a quick call." Abigail was proud when the old man decided to give rehab a try. Veronica called the closest rehabilitation center and asked them to send someone out. Mr. Morrison needed all the help he could get. While they waited, Veronica and Abigail helped the old man dispose of the empty bottle he'd been hiding under his bed. That night, Abigail and Veronica went with Mr. Morrison to the rehabilitation center. They promised to be there, waiting to take him back to the nursing home once he was all better. He thanked them over and over again. For years he'd wanted to be clean, but he didn't know how to do it on his own. He had always been ashamed of his habit. The road to recovery was never easy, but with the support of Abigail and Veronica, Mr. Morrison began to see a glimmer of hope. Day by day he worked tirelessly to overcome his addiction, attending therapy sessions and participating in group activities. Abigail visited him regularly, bringing him books to read and engaging him in meaningful conversations. She wanted him to know that he wasn't alone in this journey and that there were people who genuinely cared about his well-being. As Mr. Morrison progressed through his treatment, he started to gain a new perspective on life. He realized that he had been using alcohol as a crutch to cope with his loneliness and grief after losing his beloved wife, Doris. With the help of therapy, he began to confront his emotions and find healthier ways to deal with them. He joined support groups where he could share his experiences with others who understood his struggles. Throughout his recovery, Mr. Morrison also made efforts to reconnect with his family and mend broken relationships. He reached out to his children and grandchildren, expressing his remorse for his past actions and his commitment to change. Slowly but surely, he started rebuilding the bridges that he had once burned. His family welcomed him back with open arms, grateful to see him on the path to recovery. Mr. Morrison was even more determined to make it out a changed man. After reconnecting with the family he missed, it was the motivation he needed to turn his life around and get clean. They promised that they would visit him more regularly. It seemed like everyone had busy lives and never thought that something as simple as visiting a family member would mean the world to them. The first few weeks at the center were hard for Mr. Morrison. He missed his bed, and he missed the nurses at the nursing home. He couldn't wait to get back to them. But before he knew it, he started to feel better again. In just a few months, he managed to kick a habit he had been sitting with for multiple years. The day he left the center, Abigail and Veronica were there to pick him up, as promised. As soon as he stepped through the door of the nursing home he loved so much, he was thrilled to see that they had arranged a welcome-back party. From that day forward, the old man's life was changed forever. Long gone were the days of always feeling ill. He never called the boy back again, and in the end, everything worked out for Mr. Morrison. The experience had forged a lifelong bond between Mr. Morrison, Abigail, and Veronica. They had faced adversity together and emerged stronger because of it. As they stood side by side, they knew that they would always be there for each other, come what may. For Abigail, it was a reminder of why she had chosen to become a nurse in the first place, to make a difference in people's lives, no matter how challenging the circumstances. And for Mr. Morrison, it was a testament to the power of friendship, compassion, and the human spirit. Together they had overcome the odds and found hope in the darkest of times.